Hello, welcome to today's session. Today we will be talking about the concept of political geography, the difference between political geography and geopolitics. Then we'll be talking about geostrategy. Once we understand the differences between the three, we'll be understanding the concept of geopolitics across various regions of the world. Then we'll be talking about the various views on geopolitics given by mainly Cohen, Toal, Solan, and Agnew. So we'll start with the basic concept of what is geopolitics and how is it different from political geography. So you have geopolitics versus political geography. Now the simplest way to understand this difference is political geography is a much broader term in case of analysis because it considers everything geographically. So you are studying politics from the point of view of geography. So for example, if this is the map of North America and I draw a border here and I divide United States of America with Canada. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand this by means of political geography because I'm drawing borders, boundaries, frontiers, so everything which is static in nature, I should say in simple terms, everything which is static would be covered under political geography. On the other hand, geopolitics is much more dynamic field. And what I try to do here in geopolitics is I try to understand the political implications of every state. So everything I want to understand, I try to understand through political means. So it's basically understanding the relationship between the international politics. So what is the politics of oil? The politics of Middle East, okay, how Middle East is affecting the nearby regions, that all would be understood under the concept of geopolitics. In geopolitics, what we try to do is we try to understand the before events, what would happen before, and in political geography, what happened after drawing the boundaries between US and Canada. So it talks about after events and it talks about before events. Now we have understood the concept of geopolitics in political geography. There is a similar term which is known as geostrategy. Now geostrategy is again a different term, much different than geopolitics. What does the word geostrategy means? Geostrategy means when you are using geographical knowledge to govern the direction of a state policy. So what you are trying to do is you are trying to understand the thing strategically. So the military importance or the military power or directing of the diplomatic activities. These are all understood under the concept of geostrategy. So what we say under geostrategy is that the state has limited resources and if in case it's unable to rule the foreign policy, what would be the focus? The focus would be on the politics and the military power. And the geostrategy technically tries to explain the concept of foreign policies in a state and how to project power. So the main aim of geostrategy is to show yourself big on the earth. So that is the main reason why geostrategy is gaining much more significance these days rather than geopolitics because each and every nation is trying to project itself much bigger than it really is on the world map. Now we have understood the three concepts. Now today's lecture as we focus on geopolitics today. In geopolitics, what do we mainly understand? So there are three basic concepts we try to understand under geopolitics. First is the political character as we discussed. So the political character of any geographical region or geopolitical region. Second thing we try to understand is the academic policies that we lay down. So the academic policies of boundaries, academic policies of the nearby regions. So whatever policies we lay down that relate geopolitics, political geography and the field of IR. So Taylor interestingly said geopolitics is periphery of periphery of periphery. That means geopolitics is a periphery of political geography, which is a periphery of geography and which is again a periphery of social sciences. So that was a definition propounded by Peter Taylor on geopolitics. So we are trying to understand the academic policies of boundaries with relation to geopolitics, international relations, and political geography. And finally, we try to understand the geopolitical discourse as a proper and the struggles that a nation has to make to prove its existence or to prove its survival. So this is the basic essence of the concept of geopolitics. Now we will be covering geopolitics of the world. So here is a world map. I'll try to explain some of the major regions on the world map. So let me start with Europe. Europe, as you can see, the North Europe is a region that is highly developed. Okay, so you have good harbors, you have natural resources, bounty of coastline. So what and much Caucasian tribe, which is much more, I should say, challenging kind of people. So these people, what they technically did was they were they were good navigators, good at art and map making. So what they did were basically discoveries. So the Northern Europe did a lot of discoveries and discovered the various regions of the world. On the other hand, Southern Europe, this region, was in contact with the Northern Africa and Middle East. So this region never remained a kind of stable region by its location, I should say. So what happened is, as and when European Union was formed and EU became an organization, the regions of North and South countries came together. The North being relatively much more stable and dominant as compared to South. But in the South, you had countries like Greece, which were on the verge of recession recently. So what happened was, when EU tried to maintain a balance between the countries, a lot of resources from North went into the development of southern countries. Now, in all this, France plays a vital role in the economy because France is the major body. If that loses its command, what will slowly happen is EU will again undergo a recession because a lot of southern countries are facing recession. France is a country that is balancing the north and the south. If France undergoes a recession or a downturn, the EU would likely face severe crisis. So this is how we understand the geopolitics of Europe. Now let's move on to the next region, that's Russia here. Russia, as we can see, has a huge east-west extent, but the tragic problem of Russia is most of the rivers run here from the north-south direction. As a case, they are dividing the region perpendicularly and rather merging the region horizontally. Then you have a less population, but Russia has a lot of natural and mineral resources, especially the strategic resources. But there is not enough population to extract those resources. So that is how the geopolitics of Russia works. Communism is getting strong here. Now let's move on to the next region, that's China. China, as we can understand, is basically an export-oriented economy. So all the export go through the sea route, mainly to United States and Canada. Now what is happening here is, this sea route is mainly dominated by naval ships of US. So US at any point of time, if there is inadequate bilateral ties between the two countries, US can stop the naval routes to America, and that can affect the economy of China badly. But China, as you can see, has huge population. So it has a lot of cheap labor. Okay. Now, it has a huge coastline of nearly 9,000 kilometers, which says that China can become a superpower. Now, but there are internal problems. On the north, you have Mongols, and on the west, you have Turks. So what is happening is, the local natives of China, that is the Hans, do not get enough, despite of being a majority, on the western and the northern borders, they have constant clashes with other tribes. If there is an internal instability in the region, that would affect the geopolitics of the region. Again, Mongolia is a region which has most of the China's water bases because it's a plateau region and most of the river originates there. So if those river regions are blocked, China can face huge crisis. So there are both pros and cons for China. As we can see, again, China is the only country which can harness resources from Russia. China has a oil pipeline through Kyrgyzstan, then it has a natural gas pipeline through Turkmenistan. So you have a lot of relation of China with Middle East and China with United States, and rather we can say as the world is developing, it is becoming much more closer. Under globalization and liberalization, the world has shrunk into a smaller region rather than remaining an individual consolidated units. So China independently within itself, it does not has much of resources which it can harness and use within the country because the per capita income is very low, and because the per capita income is very low, people do not have sufficient money and resources to purchase things. So China is basically an export-oriented country, and if you have the liberalization and globalization not working around in the region, China's economy can suffer huge setbacks. Now you have the Middle East region. The Middle East, as we know, is an oil hub. The problem of Middle East arises from United States. You have Syria, Israel, Iran, constant fighting nations. So, as Cohen mentioned in his book, it is a region of Shelterbelt or kind of internal unstable region. Okay, so we'll discuss about the views of each of the geopoliticians later. So let's come to the point here. So this region is rich in oil, but due to Islamic militancy, this region does not have complete unity in itself. So it's a kind of unstable region. Then we can know US is developed hugely, but there are two major problems that United States face. First is the availability of cheap labor. It does not have a cheap labor of its own. It is dependent on cheap labor from Africa and the developing nations. Then again, it is developed for the skilled labor again. It is developed on. It is dependent on the mainly on China and India for the technical and the skilled labor. So as itself, United States, despite having huge economy, huge resources, a lot of natural power, huge reserves of minerals and oil, there is a problem of skilled labor and cheap labor. So you do not even get a cheap labor and even a skilled labor if you do not migrate people in. Okay, so it's highly dependent on manpower to other nations. So that's a major setback for or a major problem for the United States. So it needs to handle the things geopolitically. Again, US is the biggest supplier of arms and ammunition to the Middle East. So on one hand, it's supplying arms and ammunition to Middle East, and so that indirectly promotes insurgencies and militancies. But on the other hand, it has its largest revenue from defense and basically arms and ammunition. So there is kind of geopolitics that works across the globe, and the last region we would be discussing is the Indian region or the Indian subcontinent here. So again, it has a huge coastal boundary. You have cheap labor, you have lot of agriculture, self-sufficient economy, but you have again some major drawbacks with the region. Because of the colonization in India and again in Africa, I should mention these countries together. So again in Africa and India, due to colonization, there was lack of development and a lot of resources from the country were extracted by the colonialists. So these countries were slow to develop on growth. Then you have the Middle East. Then you have here in the Middle East, you have Vietnam having a very good relations, ally of United States. Most of the United States bases are in Vietnam. The major reason is Vietnam had nearly 17 wars with China, in which it was defeated, and only one war with the United States where it could win, and that gave it a kind of feeling that it is much more might be superior to the United States or something like that. But later on, it developed good relations with the United States. So you have the geopolitics of countries from one country to another, and as we can see, the whole world works into one, and you cannot say I can isolate one nation and that would be fine for the remaining nations. So this was a kind of brief outlook about the geopolitics of the world. Now let me discuss about some of the major views on geopolitics. The first view we would be discussing is by Cohen. Saul Cohen is one of the most popular geopoliticians. He talked about three basic regions in the world. He said there is a geostrategic region, then you have a potential geostrategic region, and then you have Shelterbelt regions. So he talked about two geostrategic regions. First is the trade-dependent maritime region. The trade-dependent maritime region includes countries like Japan, USA. Okay, then you have the Eurasian continental world. So this is maritime and this is continental. What Cohen said, that if a country is very good at its sea power, it cannot rule a world. If a country is very good at its land power, it cannot rule a world. To be able to rule a world, it should be able at sea power, land power, and air power. So it should have all the things geostrategically, which is important. So he said that the maritime nations are good at sea power, the Eurasian nations are good at continental power or the land power. On the other hand, you have Shelterbelts. Shelterbelts are a kind of unstable regions. So he gave two Shelterbelt regions. First is the Middle East and you have the Southeast Asia. He said both of these regions have the Shelterbelt. So he said to maintain a balance between Shelterbelt and geostrategically active region, you need to have a potential geostrategic region, which he said can be kind of Indian Ocean Plateau, which is good at sea power and land power and can emerge as a potential or an upcoming geostrategic region. Now Cohen, in his concept, talked mainly about stability. So he said that the Shelterbelt regions are the regions that are unstable. On the other hand, geostrategic regions are kind of stable regions. So his main view here was talking about the stability of a region, and this geostrategic regions he also called them as gateway regions or the much more stable regions. So this was the first view by Cohen. The second view is by John Agnew. John Agnew was again a great geopolitician. His first work was named as Geopolitics. Then in 2003, he wrote a book known as Mastering Spaces. He had few major concepts that he talked about. First was containment. What does containment mean? Containment means preventing the expansion of hostile nations. So for example, if I feel that this is my country A and I have a country B nearby and this B country is very hostile and trying to occupy territories in my country, I would try to prevent the expansion of B, and that is what is containment. The second thing he talked about was domino theory. What is domino theory? Domino theory suggests that if one country is strongly based on communism, what would happen? All the countries surrounding it would slowly and gradually adopt communism. A classic example is China. If I draw a diagram here, I can say China, then Korea, then you have Vietnam, slanting, and then it comes straight. So I can say China is a country that is kind of communist. Then this led to communism in Korea, then Vietnam, then you have Laos, then you have Cambodia, and finally Thailand and the distant countries were a bit away from the impact of communism. But the nearby countries fell prey to communism at a faster pace. So he talked about containment, he talked about domino theory, and finally he talked about hegemony or control of another group. So he talked about the hegemony stability. So these were the three concepts that Agnew mainly focused on. When he was trying to focus on these three concepts, he said that there is basically historization of an ideal state. So if I say any state is ideal, I am trying to study it from a historical perspective and find out what are the major changes that have occurred through the years into that country. So I'm trying to find out the historical essence of it, the temporal essence. Then I'm trying to find out the distinctive role of geopolitical activities in the region, and finally the character in the world order. The next important geopolitician that we would be discussing is Geoffrey Sloan. Geoffrey Sloan is a senior professor at University of Reading. So what he basically did was he talked about military doctrine. He talked about that there should be a basic doctrine or a set of rules that everyone should follow, and this military doctrine finally acts as a force multiplier. That means it increases your impact towards your goal. So military doctrine plus philosophy should be the major determinant for any war. So he said, unless and until you have a good philosophy behind what you are doing and a good strategy or a doctrine or a set of commands that you need to take into action, your military encroachment is of no use, and the rivals will sure to defeat you. So to get a victory from the rivals, you need to have a good doctrine and a good philosophy. So you must be sure that because they are destroying something good in us, we need to fight for it. Okay, so that was his main concept. Then he focused on the relation to combat the effectiveness of any action. He also talked about intelligence as a missing dimension. Intelligence as a missing dimension in international politics or international relations, I should say. So in international relations, intelligence is nowadays not that much focused as before. So if we focus more on intelligence and the intellectual activities here, we'll have a much more sound military doctrine, and that would help us in a much smoother way. The next concept and the next theory, views on political geopolitics, were given by Gerard Toal. Gerard Toal basically talked about critical geopolitics. What is meant by critical geopolitics here means he basically gave radical ideas that were aiming to remap the whole of the world. So his ideas were much more radical in nature as compared to previous geopoliticians. Then he said that British colonialism, if I talk about British colonialism or I talk about Nazi geopolitics, I talk about America's ambition or whatever has happened in Bosnia and Ireland, we try to look into the political geography or the political history for space and power in the West. So whatever happened in the West was mainly for space and power. And what we really want to do now is to remap the whole of the globe, and we need to define new boundaries in the 20th century. So he wrote one of the famous books known as Bosnia Remade. Okay. So these were some of the famous contributions or the famous views on geopolitics. Now, in the next session, we will be talking about the various models in political geography and geopolitics. We will be talking about the heartland theory by Mackinder, riverland theory by Spikeman. Then we will be talking about Shelterbelt theories, containment theories, unified field theory by Jones, and similar concepts, the functional approach and the German geopolitics. So stay tuned for the next lesson where we will be discussing more on models. Have a good day ahead.